What's up and welcome to My Point of View. I am your fat and opinionated host, and listen, I am no expert, and honestly, true crime isn't necessarily one of my main passions or hobbies. But I've looked into quite a few cases. And very often in cases like this one, the suspect returns to the scene of a crime. It would surprise you how often this happens. These crazed maniacs who do horrible things like what was done to those 4 University of Idaho students. They return to the scene. Why? I can't sit here and explain to you why these people's minds work the way they do. Maybe they feel a sense of something inside when they return to these scenes. But ever since this case came about, I was really wondering if whoever did this returned to the scene of the crime. For all we know, as law enforcement and investigators are looking through the home, conducting their investigation, whoever did this could be walking right past with their dogs. They could be driving past in maybe a Hyundai Elantra. Well, it turns out that Bryan Kohberger did return to the scene of the crime, but way sooner than I think anyone would ever have imagined. Bryan Kohberger's phone was pinged near this home on November 13th, hours after he allegedly killed those 4 students. Bryan was driving by this house between 9:12 and 9:21 a.m. in the morning. Why do you think Bryan returned so soon? Did Bryan return to see if there was any law enforcement presence, to see if anyone had found out what happened to those kids inside of that house? Did Bryan know or find out that there were other survivors in the house? Did he return to finish the job? We know that one of the roommates saw Bryan and supposedly came face to face with the guy, and the guy just walked past and left. Did Bryan even notice her in that moment? I think we have a lot of questions as to why she just decided to, I guess, go back to sleep. But we're not even going to talk about that in this video. Why did Bryan return that morning? Maybe, as we discussed over on my main channel, Cinema Shogun. If you haven't already, I have multiple YouTube channels. Go subscribe to Cinema Shogun. We know that he left a sheath behind. Maybe he thought he could return to that house and get that sheath and then leave again. I think there's a lot of possibilities here. But I can only imagine the excitement and the pleasure Bryan probably felt when he drove past the house at 9-something in the morning, and it appeared as if nothing had ever happened. No ambulances outside, no crime scene tape, no investigators walking around, no police cars lining the street. No, Bryan drove past that home, and it appeared as if nothing had even happened. The roommates hadn't even called law enforcement yet. And from my understanding, didn't, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I remember, the surviving roommate didn't even call law enforcement. They called friends who then called law enforcement. Am I correct? And that didn't happen until around 12 p.m. So there are various possibilities here as to why Bryan returned. I do think that the most likely reason would be that he returned to just. But then we have to think about Bryan's background as well. Because if Bryan is as educated as he appears to be, I think he should know better than to, oh, I'm just going to drive by the house to see if cops have, gotten here yet. I think that Bryan was maybe confident. I don't know. I don't want to say too much because I don't want, people to run with the information and point fingers at anyone. But does this show a sign of confidence from Bryan that there had been no reports of what had happened to these kids yet? If Bryan feels confidently enough to drive past this house just a few hours after committing this act, what was really going through his head? Was he confident that no 911 call had been made? Was he confident that everything was copacetic and everything was okay? Okay enough for him to drive past and to survey the situation? I know an idiot would do something like that, but I would think someone with Bryan's education would know, like, hey, maybe I shouldn't be driving past this house a few hours after I did this. So there's a lot of unanswered questions there for me. I don't know how you all feel, but for me, I really want to know why. Was he, like, in my mind, this is, I try not to say too much, but let's just be honest. In my mind, if Bryan saw that the surviving roommate, if Bryan walked right past her and saw her and left that house, then he should be panicked at that moment, Walked right past her. I would think that if I was Bryan, I would assume that she's going to call the cops. Whatever noise was happening inside that house, Dylan says that she heard cries. Now, cries and screaming, that's basically the same thing for me. But here on YouTube, if you don't use the specific word, people like to pick everything apart. Whatever noise was and commotion was going on inside that house, it was loud enough that it picked up on cameras at the next door house. So to think that people inside this house heard nothing, that was always far-fetched. But now we know that at least one of the roommates heard stuff. She thought that it was Kaylee playing with the dog. Then she heard the dog barking. She heard someone, I would assume, yell out. I would assume that at this point, someone's yelling out that someone is inside the house. She heard that, opened the door, saw nothing, heard cries, opened the door, saw a masked stranger walking through the home. If Bryan saw her that night or that early morning, why would Bryan feel confident enough to return to the scene? Wouldn't Bryan automatically assume that she's going to call 911? That is the most logical thing that anyone would do. And I'm tired of looking at cases like this and seeing young people make these weird decisions. I don't know what's going on with young people these days, but if I hear yelling or if I hear crying, thuds, a dog barking, a roommate, I would assume yelling out because you hear them coming from somewhere else in the house. Someone's in the house and then you see someone in the house. Don't just close the door and act like nothing ever happened. It's like people are disassociated with reality. But I would have to think that if Bryan saw her, that Bryan would assume that something would have come of that. So there's really a lot of unanswered questions here. But we know that Bryan returned to the scene literally like a few hours later. Was he going there because, hey, maybe I want to take out the rest of the roommates? Was he going there because he realized that in the panic of it all, he lost the sheath? And he figured that maybe he could return it to the home and get it, but obviously that didn't happen. Or was this just a routine drive-by? Let me drive by and see what's going on. It could be any of those. It's just that Bryan and his past and his education would make me believe that that third option would be less likely, because that's just not a smart thing to do. But then again, maybe Bryan isn't as smart as we think. So like I said, a lot of unanswered questions here. At the very least, we know he returned. We don't know why. We may never know why. But that's the question that will always burn on my mind. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. While you're down there, hit the thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and always remember to remain opinionated.